Before we start talking about the nitrogen cycle, let's quickly summarize the carbon cycle. If you already have this in the chart from the previous class, then you don't need to write it down again. But just to make sure that everyone understands, photosynthesis and sedimentation decrease the amount of carbon in the air. Respiration, decomposition, and burning of fossil fuels all increase carbon in the air. Looking at this in a picture way, you can see that from the atmosphere, carbon is going into plants for them to do photosynthesis, going into the ocean animals that are then becoming compressed into sedimentary rock. But when things die, when people, animals breathe, and when people burn fossil fuels, those all release carbon. Once you have an understanding of that, we can start talking about the nitrogen cycle. 78% of the air on Earth is made up of nitrogen. That might be somewhat confusing because we think of air being the thing we breathe in, being mostly made up of oxygen. But in fact, most of the air on Earth is made up of nitrogen. Living things, plants, animal, fungi, etc., can't use the nitrogen that's found in the air, but we do need to use it. So how do we get nitrogen if we can't use the nitrogen in the air? Nitrogen fixation is when nitrogen found in the air, N2, is changed into a form of nitrogen that plants can use, NO3. Bacteria and lightning are the things in the ecosystem and on Earth that can do nitrogen fixation. Again, which is just taking nitrogen found in the air and turning it into something that plants are able to use. If you've ever seen the roots of plants, you can actually see bacteria. This bacteria kind of has a symbiotic relationship with plants. It's symbiosis because they live constantly in close contact with each other. The bacteria takes nitrogen from the soil and from the atmosphere and turns it into nitrogen that plants can use, nitrogen fixation. And then the plant gives the bacteria a place to kind of anchor on. So this is mutualism. But these little circles, these little bacteria nodes, as they're called, are one of the things that can do nitrogen fixation. So why is nitrogen so important? We know why oxygen is important. It's what we need to breathe in. And carbon is what most of our bodies are made of. Well, nitrogen is important because it's actually one of the main elements in amino acids. If we think back to our first unit, the elements found in proteins were C, H, O, and N, CHON, so that N was for nitrogen. How do we and other animals get nitrogen? We get it by eating plants. So when we eat the plants, we actually take the nitrogen from them. And then we use nitrogen in order to build muscle from protein. So how does the nitrogen cycle get completed? Well, we've talked about how plants get their nitrogen from nitrogen fixation, how animals get their nitrogen by eating plants, and then nitrogen gets returned to the air and the soil through a process called excretion or decomposition. So basically, when animals either excrete solid waste or liquid waste in the form of urine, they're actually giving off nitrogen that then goes back into the atmosphere in some way. When things die, they decompose, which we talked about in the carbon cycle, and decomposition gives off all parts of the thing that died, including nitrogen. So the two ways you get nitrogen out of animals and plants and things is that they give off waste or they decompose. The important thing to think about in terms of the nitrogen cycle is it's more like the carbon cycle than the water, meaning it doesn't go in a big circular path. That would be like the water cycle. Instead, it's a whole bunch of arrows that can go in any direction. So for instance, this fox over here is getting nitrogen by eating a rabbit. It also could have gotten nitrogen by eating plants. When it dies, it's going to give off nitrogen when its whole body decomposes, but also every time it goes to the bathroom, it's also giving off nitrogen. All that nitrogen that's being given off is broken down either by bacteria or if, let's say, lightning struck. So a quick summary of the nitrogen cycle. Nitrogen fixation is what makes nitrogen usable, and it's usually bacteria and lightning that does that. People and animals then use nitrogen to form proteins, and finally, nitrogen is released when organisms excrete or go to the bathroom and when they die and decompose. Check yourself, see if you can answer these two questions. Pause the video here and write the answers in your notes. Now try questions 3 and 4. Again, pause the video here and write the answers in your notes. At this point, you should understand the 3 cycles: water, carbon, and nitrogen. If the carbon cycle is still confusing, you could go back to the beginning of this video. And if the nitrogen cycle is confusing, you should rewatch parts of this video again.